They were telling me we can get in easily with the swastika, we can get in with Norse runes, Crusader, neo-Crusader imagery. And it was a complete free-for-all during the War on Terror. And this had a huge impact on the occupied populations, obviously, because if you're sending white supremacist neo-Nazis to a country full of brown people armed with an M16, you're going to see atrocities.
British Special Forces squads who were tasked with locating and capturing suspected terrorists, quote unquote, were routinely murdering like unarmed civilians, then fabricating evidence to frame their victims as armed insurgents. And it got to the point where their excuses were so pathetic and obviously false that even their superiors were like mocking the fact that they were lying.
Thousands of these white supremacist neo-Nazi gang members are now back in the US, and they're not coming back to the US to be priests or choir boys. They want to use the training they've got courtesy of the US taxpayer to start what they call RAHOA, which is racial holy war.
Like they're presented in a very fluffy way in films and TV. They're really, really evil and dangerous, and they have a massive impact not only on the countries they're deployed to, but also back at home.
You know that Netanyahu's clever. I mean, he's an evil scumbag, but he's clever, and he knows how to play some idiot like Trump, and he plays him like a fiddle the whole time. And the only state-based opposition to Israel now, if you don't count Yemen, which is not the official government, the Houthis, is Iran. So that for them, that's the final piece of the chessboard.
I do think that the war in Iran is a total disaster for the empire, and they very much bitten off more than they can chew.
If Iran can push back the empire and win, by win I mean survive, then that will have a major impact. And in fact, that's why I think they're fighting for all of us, because the beyond them is hell.
I think it's very important stuff, because I've already written some things down that I heard you guys talk about. For example,
you were taking
China
notes while you were doing a week.
Yes, secretly.
We've all done it. Come on, let's be honest.
Dedication. I'm impressed.
Good day, everyone. We are here again with an amazing panel with two very, very impressive journalists, both from the UK. Of course, Matt Kennard and Kit Klarenberg. Both have been on our shows before. And we thought, wouldn't it be the dream panel if we get both of them together on one show, especially considering everything that's going on right now? So here we are, very privileged. Welcome, Matt. Welcome, Kit, to our small show.
Good to
Welcome,
be with you.
guys.
Hello.
So what I wanted to start with is Matt told me of his new book, Irregular Army, and that is very much related to the things that are going on today. So maybe we can start with that, Matt. Can you tell us a bit about the content of the book? What do you focus on? How does that relate to the geopolitical situation that we are in today, etc., etc.?
Yeah. So the book is Irregular Army, but the subtitle is How the US Military Recruited Neo-Nazis, Gang Members, and Criminals. And I'll run through this quickly because it is quite a long story. But effectively, the thesis of the book is that the US military broke during the War on Terror, i.e. that it couldn't staff the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the absence of doing conscription, which the Bush administration and Obama after him didn't want to do because they knew that was the straw that broke the camel's back in Vietnam, really it was conscription that turned the country against the war in Vietnam, and then pressure for withdrawal increased. They didn't want that with Iraq. So what they did instead is they kept an all-volunteer army but got rid of regulations that had previously been in place. Some of these was public, like they raised the enlistment, the enlistment age from 35 to 42, which they've actually just redone, by the way. And we should talk about how it relates to the contemporary situation. But some of it was secret, and that was the bit I focused on. So the main bit of the book is about neo-Nazis. And when I was in the States, I was interviewing countless neo-Nazi groups and also former DOD, now DOW investigators. And basically, they just told me that it was carte blanche for neo-Nazis and white supremacists during the War on Terror, by which I mean the best way of kind of knowing that someone's an extremist, absent them actually telling you, which they don't often do, is tattoos, because all these groups use tattoos to kind of show their allegiance. And they were telling me we can get in easily with the swastika, we can get in with Norse runes, Crusader, neo-Crusader imagery. And it was a complete free for all during the War on Terror. And this had a huge impact on the occupied populations, obviously, because if you're sending white supremacist neo Nazis to a country full of brown people armed with an M16, you're going to see atrocities. And there were atrocities across the board. And there was one particular guy called Kenneth Eastridge who was serving in Iraq. And he came back to the US and with two other soldier veterans killed someone and was put in prison. And actually, this is how it always happened. The only accountability that US soldiers ever got was when they came back to the US. Anything they did in Iraq was never prosecuted. But he went in it during his trial. His colleagues who were involved in the murder who said, we used to go around Baghdad just taking pot shots at locals, and that was standard. So you see this across the board. Then there's gangs, which obviously are tens of thousands of gangs joined up, and that links to the drug war in Mexico as well, because often Mexican drug gangs were using active duty soldiers because there's quite a few benefits to having active duty soldiers in your in your gang, like the fact that they move around, they have a certain protection being soldiers, they have access to weaponry. And Fort Bliss in Texas was a hotbed of this. And then criminals as well. So they have this thing called the moral waiver program, which was that there are regulations on if you're a felon or if you have a serious misdemeanor to your name, you can't enlist. But they got this program called the Moral Waiver Program, which basically just wiped the slate clean, took off massively. And again, this had a huge impact. One particular massacre called the Mahmudiya Massacre, which became famous, where a group of US soldiers went and raped a 14-year-old girl and then killed her and her whole family, then burnt the house down. That was the leader of that was called Stephen D. Green, and he got into the US military on a moral waiver. Now that case is quite interesting, because again, that case would not have been publicized because they burnt the house down and said it was the work of insurgents. And then there was only someone in their platoon who had a crisis of conscience and said what had happened, that eventually they got prosecuted for that. So it was, and then, sorry, I'll just finish with this to bring it back to now. All 2 million people served in the Middle East during the War on Terror, and thousands of these white supremacist neo-Nazi gang members are now back in the US, and they're not coming back to the US to be priests or choir boys. They want to use the training they've got courtesy of the US taxpayer to start what they call RAHOA, which is racial holy war. And you see, if you look at local newspapers, you see a steady tick of incidents of veterans involved in violent crimes, murders, drug trafficking, all this kind of stuff. So it's had a huge impact on American society. And then, just to bring it up to now, you have, and this is the mad thing, is that when I was investigating all this stuff, it was like I was seeing this imagery on soldiers in Kandahar and Fallujah and places. And now you've got Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of War. He changed the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War, which is actually more honest. We should give him some credit for that. But he himself has a Jerusalem cross on his chest. He has the word kafir in Arabic written on his arm, which is a sign that kafir is an Arabic term which is used by some Muslims to indicate unbelievers and infidels, and he wears that as a source of pride to show, like, I'm a kafir, I'm the enemy of Islam. And he's the top official in the Pentagon, the most powerful military in human history. And he talks about the war in Iran like a crusader. He says he speaks in neo-crusader imagery, in language like his neo-crusader imagery tattooed on his body. So the story really comes full circle. And this is the big point, is that we're often meant to see Trump as a kind of outlier and a wild sort of aberration within the American system. But all the stuff that was put in place by Bush and Obama during the War on Terror allowed for someone like Trump. Because the Bush administration, they called it the imperial presidency. They really concentrated executive power to the detriment of the legislative branch. And you're seeing that now. I don't even know, does America still have a legislative branch? We never hear about it. They can't do anything. A lot of that was put into place, and also allowing the free-for-all with extremists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis really created the ground for someone like Pete Hegseth to come in. So I think that this is a real important lens to view what has happened to America since 2016 through. And you saw it in some ways with Vietnam. There was a massive uptick of paramilitary and white supremacist activity after the Vietnam War as disillusioned veterans came home. And they were felt they weren't treated right. They'd fought in a war which had ambiguous results. It was seen as a failure, much like the War on Terror. And also, to go back to the early 20th century, the birth of fascism in Italy. That was Mussolini used a lot of veterans of the First World War, and again, it was although Italy won, they didn't get the people who fought said, what have we actually got for winning and all these sacrifices we've made? And he took advantage of that. And you're seeing that with Trump, because obviously the War on Terror was a bipartisan failure. It was the Democrats and the Republicans. So he comes in as this outsider who says he's going to make America great again. No more regime change, democracy building wars. Well, we know that was a lie, but he used all that rhetoric and riled up an American population which was scarred by these wars to really get into power. So you're kind of seeing history replay itself. But when you talk about the rise of fascism in the States, and I think it is what we're seeing is the rise of fascism, you don't often hear the military explanation. And I think it's a very, very important one, because obviously we know that half the congressional budget in the US is spent on the Pentagon. It's by some estimates, $1.4 trillion a year. It's the most important institution within US society. US is now what's called a stratocracy. It's ruled by the military. And I think to understand America, you have to understand the military institution. And the book really is an investigation into the reality of what's happening there underneath all the propaganda.
And weirdly, it's one of the most trusted institutions in the U.S. if polls are to be believed. Just one really quick follow-up question: is this at all related, do you think, to the rise of special forces operations, or do you think these are two kind of separate developments?
I mean, it is as well, because obviously secrecy generates corruption and criminal activity, and the special forces are much more secretive than the regular military. I didn't actually look too much into the special forces because I didn't have the access. But Seth Harp, the American journalist, has just written a best-selling book, which is really, really good, called The Fort Bragg Cartel, which goes into this and how much criminal activity happens at Fort Bragg within the special forces. So it is related, but that is a major trend in military since the War on Terror, basically. Because, sorry, I'll just finish with this. That part of the reason this all went to shit is because Rumsfeld's idea was he wanted a slimmed down US military, right? His whole idea was you just send in small special forces missions. And in fact, in Afghanistan, that worked initially. They bribed local warlords and got to Kabul pretty quickly and took over that country pretty quickly. Obviously, it became a bit of a disastrous occupation, but he thought they could do the same in Iraq, and they were not ready for the level of occupation that was needed and the level of troops. And that was why they hadn't planned for it. They couldn't deal with it without conscription. So, and this debate rolls on again, like how big should we have a big land army? Should we just focus on agile, flexible special forces? And this is the debate that goes on in the military now. But I don't know too much about what happens within the special forces. But if you really want the story on that, look at Seth Harp's book.
Right, and I noticed that it's good that you mentioned this whole case of the 14-year-old girl, because this is often ignored. People always talk about they talk about torture and they talk about brutal killings and going to villages and shooting people and all that stuff. But sex trafficking is a very big issue. I actually remember reading about a case that was actually found in the WikiLeaks about what happened in Iraq and how many soldiers were actually raping children in Iraq and also impregnating them and then killing them. And this stuff, nobody has ever been prosecuted for that stuff. I mean, this is really, really evil, sick stuff that is happening there. And when you're saying about those neo-Nazis, Matt, I actually remember a conversation that Peter and I recently had with Anthony Aguilar from. He's a soldier. He was a private contractor, former soldier, then private contractor, and went to Gaza to. He thought to help, but he found out it was one big gang of crazies that were part of those private contractors. For example, what you're saying as well, he said that one group called the Infidels, I think, Infidels or something, which are hardcore. What's that, Peter?
Infidel motorcycle gang.
Yeah, infidel motorcycle gang who are also hardcore right-wing Christian fascistic types. And they go into Palestine to rape and murder innocent Palestinians. And this is the kind of immoral way that U.S. empire is throwing onto the world. And it's going completely mayhem. It's going completely crazy. I mean, you had the right-wing death squads, of course, in Latin America. And, of course, you, Kit, you did a lot of research on the funding of terroristic and extremist types in West Asia, just like these terroristic types in Ukraine. And I think that is very much related to what Matt said, Kit, that kind of dynamic of these private militias for the U.S. empire. We see the same in West Asia right now, and also the Kurds, for example, that they want to mobilize against Iran. Am I seeing that correctly, Kit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of points there. I might add that Matt's book is absolutely excellent as well. So do check that out as well as Seth Harp's. But yeah, I mean, a lot to unpack there. I mean, I do think that the war on terror is ground zero for a large, number of issues that we're seeing today. I think it absolutely, in many ways laid the foundations for the genocidal disaster of the war on Iran as well, in more ways than one. But I think it goes back even further to, if you go back to 1999, and then you have the NATO bombed Serbia for 78 straight days without UN Security Council clearance. That kind of created the world in every way that we're living in now. It inspired interventionists on both sides of the Atlantic. It's often forgotten that Tony Blair was like really pressuring the US to bomb civilian targets, to deploy ground forces. And then when Milosevic capitulates after 78 days, suddenly the narrative becomes, well, Blair's been proven right, and his belligerent, force-first strategy, it should be repeated and repeated over and over again. And of course, then in the wake of 9/11, you have Tony Blair immediately contact George Bush and start pressuring him to launch a wave of muscular military interventions across West Asia. I think the ultimate plan was to invade Iran, like they'd done, with Iraq and Afghanistan. They certainly had enough soldiers in countries bordering Iran to do that. But because it was such a disaster, from a financial, military, and political perspective, the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, there were an enormous amount of adverse consequences as a result that we live with on a kind of cultural and societal level as well. If you look at what, say, for instance, Britain's SAS were doing in Afghanistan, there's an ongoing. It's been rather forgotten, but there's been an ongoing inquiry which is looking at the SAS activities in Afghanistan. I think it's a small window of like 2010 to 2013. And it basically has uncovered reams of evidence that British Special Forces squads who were tasked with locating and capturing suspected terrorists, quote unquote, were routinely murdering like unarmed civilians, then fabricating evidence to frame their victims as armed insurgents. And it got to the point where their excuses were so pathetic and obviously false that even their superiors were like mocking the fact that they were lying, in internal communications. But they were also extremely worried about, quote unquote, when the next WikiLeaks occurs, because they thought that they would get busted for doing this. And then, you have a lot of the reality of the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. They were pointless, costly nightmares. And you mentioned that that Mahmadiyya rape, kind of rape and murder case. One of the I've listened to some podcasts by the whistleblower who exposed this, like the U.S. military operative. He specifically talks about how their daily routine was just like walking around having to check every single vehicle if it had been mined with an IED. You don't know if you're going to die or not. This is like deeply traumatizing stuff, and for what? Like, and so you come back home, you're pissed off, and you have the option of, like getting involved in some kind of paramilitary nationalist force, or you can join become a government contractor and earn lots of money for doing what you were doing before, except at arm's length for the government. So, that is, it's not something that's particularly spoken about. It really should be, because particularly I saw Matt posted earlier today on the dreaded X about the D notice that was applied to the presence of British special forces in Gaza from pretty much from the start of the Gaza genocide. I believe it was October 28th, 2023, that as we discussed when we last spoke, the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee was moved very quickly to prevent reporting on the SAS being involved in quote-unquote counter-terrorist operations in Gaza. So we can imagine like the kind of thing that they've been doing there. This is now, there is zero absence there is a total absence of consideration within the mainstream about the reality of special forces. They remain kind of venerated, as these kind of heroic crack squads of kind of crusading warriors, etc. Like they're presented in a very fluffy way in films and TV. They're really, really evil and dangerous, and they have a massive impact not only on the countries they're deployed to, but also back at home too. And I think that's something that Matt really nails in his book. Again, really vital reading.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you guys want to talk about this, but I'm kind of curious, and since you guys are both journalists, maybe you have a better I'm sure you have a better understanding than I do, because I find this quite confusing. The two competing narratives, the U.S. government narrative about the downed pilot, and then the Iranian government narrative about this actually being an operation to capture uranium, and then the various evidence. I mean, in the fog of war, do either of you have a very clear idea of that, or is it, the information that would be dispositive is still impossible to get?
I don't have any information about the down pilot, obviously, that anyone else doesn't have. But effectively, it does seem like the Americans were doing something they shouldn't have, and it's unclear how they got that plane down. But it's a major victory for the Iranians, and in fact, the Iranians have had a good campaign so far, and you're seeing that with the recent ceasefire, which effectively, if you look at the 10 points that Iran stipulated to sign that for that ceasefire, they're very strong, and any power like the United States that was winning would not sign that, would not agree to basic. And Trump said we basically agree with all of them. So I don't know what will happen. No one knows what will happen. My sense is that it's gonna restart, because effectively the policy is being driven by Israel. And I know this is controversial to say that, and people don't like to hear this, because I don't even know why, but I think part of it is people don't want to feed into anti-Semitic tropes. But the fact is, the facts are the facts. If it does seem that US policy is being guided by Israel, then we have to go with the facts. And in fact, there was an article in the New York Times based on senior sources just a couple of days ago, which said that Netanyahu went to Washington, as we know, but he did a closed door briefing for Trump with slides and all this nonsense, and pitching the attack on Iran. And that Netanyahu's clever. I mean, he's an evil scumbag, but he's clever, and he knows how to play some idiot like Trump, and he plays him like a fiddle the whole time. And Trump is deeply embedded in the Zionist network within the United States. Miriam Adelson gave $100 million to his campaign. Miriam Adelson being one of the chief Israel lobbyists, wife of Sheldon Adelson, who died a couple of years ago, but was also one of the chief Israel lobbyists, billionaire. So the structure is, they've just worked to structure around him. Even the Epstein files, if you saw, one of the most interesting ones was the FBI report that said that Jared Kushner had been cultivated by the Israelis and basically was working for the Israelis. And it came out recently that a senior British official who was part of the Iran negotiations, he said that Stephen Winkoff and Jared Kushner, he viewed them as Israeli agents. So all this is documented. It's just a logical sort of analysis to say that US policy is being driven by Israel. And I'm not saying that the US empire and US power has any compunction with destroying countries, because we've seen it happen countless times. Look at Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and many, many other places, as Kit mentioned, Serbia. I mean, there's just countless examples. But I think that in terms of the Middle East, policy is driven by Israel. So, and that is why they haven't attacked Iran until now. It's not because they haven't wanted to, the US. It's because strategically they knew it would be very, very hard to do without a ground invasion. The Iranians took over. The Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, and they've been an anti-imperialist force since then. And as we know, that's the thing that the US empire doesn't tolerate, is any kind of state or movement that doesn't take orders. So they wanted to get rid of it since then, but they haven't done it because of the problems. And the topography of Iran as well would be if you did a ground invasion, it would make Iraq look like a cakewalk. It's not easy to do. There's 100 million people in that country. So Netanyahu's just maneuvered into it. I think what I think that they see their opportunity, though. I don't think the Israelis will stop now until they have pushed for a full, I don't even know, regime changes. I think their bottom line now. They wouldn't do this now. I don't know how they'll do it if they can't get Trump to do a ground invasion, but they're not going to stop now, because the Israelis also have such control over Trump, even more than they've had over Democrats and Republicans in the past. So they see this as a window to get all the stuff done they've wanted to do for many, many years. Because again, Netanyahu's been pushing for Iran since he first became prime minister in 1996. He's wanted to get his whole plan. Netanyahu's plan was to shift the balance of power in the Middle East towards Wahhabi, Sunni Wahhabism. And this came out recently, conversations that were had in the 90s and then after the Lebanon war in 2006, where he said, we basically got to flip it away from Iran. And they've done it in Syria. They got rid of Assad and they've installed this Al-Qaeda and ISIS former commander who is apparently Israel attacked Lebanon through Syria the other day, and one of his first acts in power, Ahmed al-Shara, was to lock up members of or leaders of the Palestinian resistance, who were based in Syria. So this is all, and the only state-based opposition to Israel now, if you don't count Yemen, which is not the official government, the Houthis, is Iran. So that for them, that's the final piece of the chessboard, and I don't think they'll stop. But Iran, I mean, I'd like to hear what you guys think. I think they've been quite naive over recent years, because this was always going to happen. The Israelis were pushing for it again and again, and the Americans. Donald Trump ordered the assassination of Soleimani in 2020 in his first term. And that is an act of war. You can't kill the top general of a country in Iraq, where they lured into Iraq, then drone bombed him in a car. You can't do that and it not be an act of war. And that was 2020. We know they've been killing, assassinating nuclear scientists for years and years and years. Sophisticated cyber warfare against the nuclear. So they've been trying to pick everyone off, and then finally killing the Ayatollah. They're like, right. The Iranians say, well, okay, strategic patience, so-called, is over now. But this point was going to happen at some point. It's just whether, I think that Iran is kind of the last line of defense now. If they get Iran and they manage regime change there, they'll carry on and carry on and carry on. Well, they already talk about Cuba and there's a siege on Cuba. But my point is, if Iran can push back the empire and win, by win I mean survive, then that will have a major impact. And in fact, that's why I think they're fighting for all of us, because if beyond them is hell. Beyond them is a completely dislocated, fragmented Middle East and wider region. And I struggle to think of what kind of world we'll be left with if they force the Iranian government from power.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, what is left? That's you're exactly my thoughts, Matt. What is it's really up? It's really the last bastion, you could say. Iran. What happens if Iran falls? It's you can almost say close to total victory of U.S. and Zionist empire, and that is a very very dark world for all of us. So I am not understanding the passivity of the rest of the world where it comes to supporting Iran, because I don't think people really realize what kind of inflection point we are at right now. Yeah, I shiver at the thought of what happens if Iran would fall, and that brings me to the question that's related to what you just said, Matt, about the naivete of Iran. I really want to hear your opinion, and I'll start with you, Kit. What do you think about the ceasefire right now? So everybody is saying, everybody's immediately going online, oh, victory for Iran, victory for Iran. And we know how U.S. empire works with ceasefires and bullshitting their enemies. So I'm wondering, do you think that this was a wise move to engage in this kind of ceasefire? My personal feeling is, and I want to hear your opinion, is that the same thing is happening as what happened with Syria. That is, they had a ceasefire with Lebanon, I remember, so they had a bit of breathing space, and they could topple the Assad government, and they could take over Syria and then back to Lebanon. I think the same thing is happening right now. It's the fronts. There are too many fronts. So they're now saying, okay, we're going to negotiate, Iranians. So let's have a chat in Pakistan. And then in the meantime, massive blitzkrieg on Lebanon. Hopefully it falls. And then full attention to Iran. That's my feeling. I don't know if Iran is still naive. I hope not. What is your assessment, Kit?
Well, I mean, as horrific and shocking as the recent attack, the kind of post ceasefire or ceasefire breaking attack on Lebanon by Israel was, this was actually telegraphed in, I believe it was Haaretz at the start of April. They published a report that the Israeli occupation forces were in very serious trouble in southern Lebanon. Bearing in mind that they wanted to initially, like people like Smotrich were calling for outright annexation of southern Lebanon. They got pretty handily battered by Hezbollah. They suffered very heavy casualties and like record equipment and vehicle losses, including like 21 Merkava tanks in a single day. So at the start of April, Haaretz said, well, one thing that we could do is kind of put a pause on the Iran war to focus all of our energy on Lebanon and thus facilitate the occupation of southern Lebanon and the neutralization of Hezbollah. Like, I mean, that's not going to happen. Although, the Israelis are dropping leaflets like warning Christians and Druze residents of Lebanon not to shelter Shiites, which is just Nazi stuff, really. But yeah, I mean, I do think that the war in Iran is a total disaster for the empire, and they've very much bitten off more than they can chew, without the requisite assets or muscle to even contemplate invading the country. I mean, I've seen that this morning being Friday, the 10th of April, that I've seen some reports that there is a significant US build-up, which could be the prelude to a ground invasion, although that would be completely suicidal. In the spirit of these things, war is very easy to get into, it's very difficult to get out of. But I mean, the picture is very, very discrepant. Nonetheless, it is pretty clear, and I've reported on this, that the US and Israel are running out of missile interceptors, and they're running out of ammunition very, very, very quickly. I mean, they can still drop heavy bombs from the air and bunker busters on civilians, but in terms of which is horrific, horrific and inflicts a significant cost on the resistance and Iran and Hezbollah et al. But at the same time, you can't win wars like that, which as the 1999 bombing of Serbia demonstrated. Air power alone is not enough. An interesting wrinkle in this as well. I mean, we were talking about where these ideas come from. The Frank McKenzie, who was the former kind of CENTCOM commander, who he oversaw the US's disastrous retreat from Afghanistan. In late March, he openly boasted about how the war in Iran was unfolding according to a strategy drawn up by CENTCOM over many years, and he boasted that my fingerprints are on this war plan, which is it is kind of bitterly ironic, because in September 2024, McKenzie wrote this paper for a Zionist lobby group called JINSA, which is the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. And he warned in September 2024 that Iran had developed a large and highly capable missile and drone force which could destroy US bases in West Asia. It could destroy the US Air Force installations and overwhelm US air defenses throughout the region. So these risks were known, but I think there was a certain hubris that was just thought, well, if we hit Iran hard enough, then this won't be a problem. I mean, it very much is a problem. I've written about how Iran has, in a very meticulous and forensic way, has systematically destroyed US radar systems with pinpoint precision. They have effectively forced US occupation forces throughout the Gulf into hiding in hotels, which Iran can then locate them and hit them. There's no guarantee that what's been destroyed is going to be repaired or replaced anytime soon. I don't think that's even possible. Within the first 16 days of this godforsaken conflict, the amount of munitions that were fired by the US and Israel just shooting down low-cost Shahed drones, that cost them many billions. It's going to take years to replenish what was spent, and these stockpiles are pretty to say the least finite. I believe it was the CEO of Rheinmetall who said that global munition stockpiles are empty or nearly empty, and that was a while back. So I do think that a pause is absolutely, from the perspective of the US and Israel, absolutely necessary. I don't think they're going to be able to regroup and rearm as they intend to, but I don't think this is anywhere near over. And the attitude of a lot of Iranians that I've spoken to, including people who are not could not be plausibly accused of being government mouthpieces. They're in this for the long haul. They think, well, this has gone on so long, and as Matt mentioned, there have been so many provocations, assassinations of senior IRGC officials. Of course, the killing of Ali Khamenei, which, funnily enough, a Zionist think tank explicitly warned against doing because his successor might be more dangerous. It's gone so far that really this kind of needs to be resolved now. Like we can't leave Israel and the US battered and bruised, but still enormously threatening to the wider region. So I mean, I guess we'll see what we see. I might add as well, another wrinkle to consider here is that a lot of people don't, is that all of this debate over Iran's supposed nuclear program. The basis of the claim that Iran is seeking nuclear weapons, if not has developed them already, it was an MI6 black propaganda campaign, which was explicitly intended to bounce Obama into a hostile position on Iran. In 2008, the Daily Telegraph reported on a secret assessment drawn up by then Prime Minister Gordon Brown's ambassador to the US, who said, well, if Obama wins this, he could take a more moderate and constructive approach to Iran, and we don't want that. I've reported on leaks that show that MI6 was specifically behind the international sanctions push, which was predicated on the notion Iran was enriching uranium for nuclear weapons purposes. It was always a lie. I'm old enough to remember at this time when it was axiomatically stated on Question Time that Iran wanted a nuke, if not had a nuke, and would use it against Israel, and this was terrible, and we need to encircle Iran because it's so dangerous. So I mean that aspect of it's rather forgotten, like in all of these debates about whether will Iran agree to another kind of joint plan of action as was inked under Obama to ensure their compliance with the IAEA and requirements and limitations on nuclear research. It's a completely pointless debate, which was begun by the British explicitly to harm Iran's relations with the West. We see, Spain is now re-establishing diplomatic relations with Iran. It's quite clear that the wider script of a united Western and kind of proxy front, including countries like South Korea and Japan, they levied very harsh sanctions on Iran. That's kind of coming unstuck now, and the longer this goes on, the greater question, all manner of questions about like Western occupation, not only of West Asia but places like Cyprus. I mean, for decades, as I think Matt even made a documentary about this, which is again very worth checking out. Like for decades, the Britain has operated bases on Cyprus without really much in the way of public discussion about why they're there. Keir Starmer, even himself, when he visited Akatori, it's called Akatori, the base there, he said he praised the British soldiers on the base, but said, we can't disclose what you're actually doing, which is very reassuring, not sinister at all. But now it's now a mainstream issue in Cypriot politics. This kind of unites people. Like, we don't really want the British here anymore. It makes us a target and doesn't really offer us much in the way of benefits. That's a debate that the British have not wanted to happen for a very long time, whether at home or within Cyprus. So yeah, I mean, the world is in a state of flux, and what it will look like at the end of this, whenever that comes, I don't know. It's frightening, but also somewhat thrilling to kind of be on the front line. But I mean, yeah. This is not good, and I do think that the prospect of nukes coming into play at some point can't be ruled out, which is pretty horrifying.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's the first thing, the first worry on my mind as well. When it comes to the question of the ceasefire, I would just point out the same thing I pointed out last year at the end of the 12-day war.
This is not the end of the show. The show actually continues for another hour, a total of 2 hours of this amazing panel. We will touch on topics such as China, Russia, and the future of the Iran war. To see the full show, subscribe to our Substack. YouTube is squeezing the hell out of our channel, so we hope to slowly get away from YouTube. Come to our Substack to see the full show. Link is in the description.
No change, no silence.